Assalamu alaikum and good evening, and welcome to the South African Debate Initiative YouTube channel and whatever platform you are viewing. My name is Yusuf Ismail and I'm your host for this evening's session. Now, today we have a very interesting guest all the way from New York. Professor Asma Barlas is a Pakistani-American writer and academic. Her specialities include comparative and international politics, Islam and Quranic hermeneutics, and women's studies. Barlas was one of the first women to be inducted into the Foreign Service in 1976. 6 years later, she was dismissed on the orders of General Zia-ul-Haq. She worked briefly as an assistant editor of the opposition newspaper, The Muslim, before receiving political asylum in the United States in 1983. Barlas joined the politics department of Ithaca College in 1991, where she was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity for about 12 years, and presently a retired professor emeritus. She's also the writer and author of a number of books, one of which is Believing Women in Islam, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Qur'an. And I can tell you this as a second-time reader of this particular book, this is an absolute sledgehammer towards Islamophobes and fanatics alike. Well, I have her in with me, joining me for this evening's session. Assalamu alaikum, Professor, and how do you do?
Walaikum assalam, Yusuf. I'm doing well, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure to have you, and it's something that I've been really looking forward to for the past couple of weeks. I just want to give the background that I first heard about your book when it was introduced by the Ziauddin Sardar, an individual who I've had dealings with, I think in 2004, 2003, in the New Statesman, where he did a book review of your particular book. Quite an interesting book review. I never got to read it, though. I forgot about it after a number of years. And in 2020, it kind of popped up on my radar during the COVID pandemic, and I then started reading it. And I found it so unique in the field of work on women's studies about Islam, and certainly the themes that were being raised was something unique that you don't normally see on an everyday scale, in your Islamic book. So it's quite a conceptually difficult book to navigate. You have to concentrate. I just want to know what was the purpose, the background, and the context behind the book, and indeed the significance of you getting down to, pouring your kind of research and scholarly output on this particular material.
Well, as you can imagine, there's hardly ever only just one context for writing, and for me there were several. One was sort of a generic anger at how Muslim women are treated in most of our societies, and after I came to the US, I was also rather appalled to read some of the literature on Islam, particularly when I started teaching a course on the Middle East. And at a personal level, I think it was largely my own educational background. So maybe I should say that.
Professor, did you find the literature lacking? Because if I recall, and I was in school in the 90s, in the apologetics field and the field of dawah and debate, so to speak, there were these tracks and these books and material out there, people like Dr. Jamal Badawi and Kokab Siddiqui and so on, and even to a certain extent, Didat, the late Didat. I mean, they were presenting a kind of an apologetic sort of response to the allegations of patriarchy being leveled against the Qur'an and Islam, and indeed the idea that Islam in fact oppresses women. But at an academic level, did you not come across anything? Because I can't, for the life of me, recall anything written back then on the level that you have in your book.
Yusuf, actually, I came to the US to do PhD in international studies. So I was not reading about Islam. I had very little knowledge of Islamic history or theology. And that's because though I was born in Pakistan in a Muslim household, I was educated just like my parents had been in Catholic convents run by European nuns. And I graduated from a Presbyterian college. My parents, of course, had grown up in British India, as it was known. And so we even spoke English as a first language at home. So our education was deeply, thoroughly Eurocentric. And anytime I can't remember actually reading much about Islam growing up. And whatever little I read was hardly, shall we say, very flattering to Muslims. Like Muslims had no history, no culture, no civilization, no philosophy, nothing. So that didn't change for me in graduate school because, as I said, my trajectory was very different. And Quranic hermeneutics is entirely outside my own disciplinary field. And I was going to say that the reason I was drawn to it eventually to write about the Quran in particular is because of what I was reading about it in the US media and from a US perspective. I hadn't really read much about Islam from the perspective of Muslims. And so at home, I was taught to read the Quran in English, in Arabic, starting at 10. But I didn't know for years what I was reading. And so it was only after I started to read English language translations, sometimes in my teens, that I became interested in the Quran. So the interest in the Quran predates my writing about it by, I would say, about 30 years or 25 years.
Well, I think one of the kind of core attacks of your book, if you want to pin down one particular aspect that is so fundamental to the book Believing Women in Islam is the idea that you attack the notion of the Quran being a patriarchal text. And I mean, that kind of takes us to this other aspect or element, because to define itself what patriarchy means could mean different things in different societies and different communities. I don't think there's some sort of set forth, fixed, defined definition of what patriarchy is. So a lot of the books, and you basically mentioned this, that the Quran is anti-patriarchal, and the fact that you are convinced that one of the primary reasons Muslims have failed to recover the Quran's, what you described as anti-patriarchal episteme, has to do with the fact that they haven't systematically addressed that particular question. The first issue I want you to understand, want us to unpack, is what would you define patriarchy as, at least? And if it's defined in a particular fashion, are we saying that the Quran attacks that notion? Because 6th century, 5th century, 7th century Arabia was a highly patriarchal society. I mean, even during the time of the Khulafa Rashidin and subsequent generations amongst the Abbasids and the Umayyad dynasty. So how would you define it? I mean, the Quran is one thing, but Muslim civilization, even at the earlier classical period, was indeed patriarchal. What would you say to that?
So I would say that, people, when I talk about patriarchy, I don't just mean a generic male privilege. Rather, I mean very specific forms of male privilege. So I define it in two ways. One is historically, for precisely the reason you've said. Historically, patriarchy was the tradition of rule by the father/husband in his capacity both as a father and as a husband. In medieval Europe, in medieval Saudi, I refuse to call it Saudi Arabia because I think it's sort of strange that the Saudi family would give its own surname to an entire continent, but that's leaving it aside. In Arabia, patriarchy was very much a tribal thing. Men had the right of life and death over wives and children. We know that they buried the newborn girls alive. So historically, patriarchy was the rule of the father. And in religious traditions, this rule justifies itself by representing God as male. God as father and as male. Certainly in Christianity. In Judaism, God is not father, but God is conceptually, if not conceptually, at least linguistically masculinized. Male. So that's one definition. But patriarchy today doesn't exist in this form everywhere. It's more now a secular politics of what we can call sexual differentiation, and by which I mean the tendency to map specific gender traits onto biological sex, so that for you to be a male, for me to be a female, means that you, Yusuf, because you're biologically a male, have X gender attributes. And the man gets to have all the good attributes, rationality, intelligence, virtue, so on and so forth. And the woman is defined basically as a lack, the man's other. So I also define patriarchy as a politics of sexual differentiation. And the short answer to the question of why I read the Quran as an anti-patriarchal text is because God is neither father nor male. The Quran is explicit that God is unlike everything in creation. So that's one reason God is not father and male, and God explicitly rejects being called father when it says, Jesus is not my son, I am not the father of Jesus. And it criticizes
blasphemy. It's actually viewed, it's strangely enough, it's viewed as blasphemy. Yeah.
So God rejects being patriarchalized, and since the Quran is God's speech, one of my arguments is that if God is not a patriarch, God is not a male. Why would God's speech, therefore, represent any patriarchal values intrinsically? So whatever elements of male privilege we see in the Quran, we can understand those to be addressed to historically specific circumstances. The other reason I read the Quran as anti-patriarchal is because it has no concept of gender in it, which is to say it does not assign any gender symbolism to biological sex. This is something Wadud also noted in her book, that there's no concept of gendered man and woman in the Quran. But what's interesting to me on that account is that Wadud felt that the Quran was neutral to social and marital patriarchy, but she also didn't define what she meant by the term. And in fact, few of the people who've called Islam patriarchal have ever defined the term. So for me, conceptual clarity was a starting point.
Sister, Asma, could I just ask one aspect, but I don't want to go via the other terrain. The one aspect which, because I may just forget it, is the one element of criticism against Wadud's writings, which is also the same level of criticism that you could level against those ultra-conservatives, is that both sides of the equation seem to adopt an atomistic interpretation of scripture, in the sense that, as you've pointed out in many instances, they don't look at the text holistically, but they look at certain aspects and portions. And if I recall, there was some degree of criticism against Wadud on that particular level herself, and indeed Farid Isaac, that they also adopted in certain instances an atomized interpretation of the Quran to particularly postulate a certain theological point, which was the same criticism that can be leveled against the ultra-conservatives. So you've got two sides of the equation here, the one being the ultra-conservatives, what you call the religious right, and then, of course, the far left, the religious left on the other side. And I think what I see your position is you adopt this element of maintaining some sort of balance and moderation in approaching the text.
I'm not sure that I have read any critiques of Wadud for being atomistic. In fact, I think that was her critique of classical scholars, that they read the Quran, one word and line and passage at a time, starting from the beginning and going to the end, and that they don't seek any hermeneutical connections between different themes in the Quran, which is very important to do because, as you know, it's not a linear text. It was revealed over 23 years. And so it reverts on itself. And sometimes its position shifts and becomes more complex over time. So I'm not aware of that critique of Wadud, but I will say this, that you're right, that the Quran is held hostage to no more than about 5 or 6 passages. And sometimes they're not even passages, Yusuf, they're single words.
Yeah.
Like the word that's translated as beat, Kawamun that's translated as guardians, and according to a Grand Mufti of Cairo, jailers of women. So it's on single words that the entire text meanings start to hinge. And so when there is such a fight and such a struggle over meaning, then is it surprising that both sides are struggling in the same terrain? And in some ways, so am I. But for me, the point of departure is that I do not read the Quran separate from how I read the Quran statements about God. So I would say that I read the Quran within a theological framework that takes the attributes, some of the attributes of God that the Quran mentions as my theological and hermeneutical framework. So if the Quran says God is inimitable, I begin reading the Quran with the a priori assumption that God is not male. So if God is not male, God is not partisan to men. If God is not partisan to men, then how come classical knowledge and even contemporary scholars implicate God in the sexual politics of patriarchies? But God didn't ordain these. These already
Not
were
at all.
existing, right? So it's that kind of an approach.
But tell me, if for example, then Muslims or certain Muslims, or at least a significant portion of the classical traditionalist Muslims have read the notion of patriarchy and sexual inequality into the Quranic text on the basis of what you pointed out, specific verses, they would then justify their position based, of course, on the idea that they've got some sort of historical religious precedents, being the classical commentaries, which is also discussed at length in your particular book. But their counter argument is that, well, they've got some sort of traditional basis to anchor their specific interpretations, albeit appealing to Ibn Kathir or, I wouldn't look at Zamakhshari, but Ibn Kathir, Ibn Jari Tabari, some of the other classical commentaries. But they would claim that, look, this is our interpretation of the Quran, but it's not done in a fashion which is unanchored. It is anchored in tradition. That would be their position. And so what would your response be to that particular argument? Would it be, as you've mentioned, that a lot of these commentators and the classical commentators were indeed themselves also products of their time, focusing on introducing the Israeliyat, classical Jewish patriarchal commentaries into their text, and of course at the same time atomize scripture itself?
Well, you've answered me. You've answered half the question yourself, so that's true. I would agree with you. But in addition, I would say that Al-Ghazali said that tradition is also created. It isn't something that falls from the sky.
Ghazali himself was, he held these patriarchal. If you look at Ihya Ulumuddin, I mean, even for example, his discussion on heavenly virgins for men and all that kind of information, all these scholars, all of them have their kind of, I don't want to call it the skeletons in their closet. They all are products of their time. And I'm saying that we can't get away with it from the fact that Islamic history is so entrenched in patriarchy, despite the fact that the Quran, is by no means patriarchal.
Okay, so to sort of complete my thought about tradition, it is to say that we can't be more, shall we say, committed to tradition than we can to the idea that the Quran is polysemic. The Quran itself says it urges us to read it for its best meanings. I don't know what that suggests to other Muslims, but to me, the basic suggestion is that it can be read in more than one way. Otherwise, the notion of best doesn't make sense. If the Quran recognizes its own polysemic nature, if the Quran recognizes that that it refers to some of what Kenneth Craig calls periodically contextual nature of some of its contents. In other words, if the Quran recognizes its own relationship to history, why don't Muslims? So it's very convenient to borrow selectively from tradition. And I think to cling to tradition at the cost of foreclosing the idea that the Quran's meanings are limitless and endless means that we tie the Quran to a 7th century Arab patriarchy. In the same breath, we claim that it came for all of humanity. So if we make the Quran particular, then it can't be universal. But my point is that revelation itself is both particular and universal. It's particular because it addressed 7th century Arabs in the reality of their own lives. The Quran took seriously what was on the ground and it addressed those circumstances. It addressed social roles. It addressed gender hierarchies. But my basic claim is that simply addressing a historical contingency doesn't make the contingency itself normative. The Quran didn't say this is how it will be till the end of time. We cannot believe in an all-knowing God and at the same time believe that God wouldn't have known that historical structures change, gender roles change, people change. So it's important for us to be able to make those distinctions between what was particular, that is to say historically specific, like slavery, the Quran's allusions to slavery. It doesn't mean that the Quran mandated that you and I should go out today and get slaves. I believe the same can be said about 7th century forms of male authority vis-a-vis women. That the Quran gave men certain rights, but read in the context of the 7th century, those rights were actually limitations. And I've spent a lot of time and energy explaining why the right to polygyny was a limitation, not an open door for men to marry any woman that they wanted for whatever reason. So this is about our relationship to history versus our relationship to the Quran. The Quran is a historical. If the Quran is a historical, then we need to be able to contextualize it and recontextualize it until the end of time.
So, taking me back to that notion that, in fact, if indeed it addressed the sort of patriarchal norms that were present in the 7th century, we could then conclude that some of the passages of the Quran were indeed, in many instances, historically specific. But I mean, since you've alluded to the aspect of polygamy or polygyny, could one not argue that by extension, since polygyny, firstly, it was not institutionalized by the Quran, it existed in the kind of context in Arabia, and of course the Quran limited it, but allowed it or barely permitted it to deal with certain collective contingencies that arise from time to time, like, for example, if it's sanguinary warfare or mass genocide where women are widows and so on. My question to you, or to, for example, someone like Amina Wadud, who you cite, is that if those conditions find themselves in society today, where, for example, you've got a disproportionate amount of widows in society, and of course, you have a situation where there's endless warfare, there's the deprivation in society, would that, in a certain instance, then perhaps allow or necessitate for the permissibility of polygyny in that particular context, taking into account, of course, that the Quran speaks about polygamy and the allowing of marrying more than 4. Immediately after it deals with the issue of orphans. You cannot deal justly with the orphans and marry among them 2 or 3 or 4. Now, my point is that if those conditions exist today, would then not polygyny be possibly a necessity in the event, as a kind of a protective mechanism that, they become part of our communities and widows and orphans are inducted into society in a general sense? What would your take and response be on that?
I don't read it as a way to deal with widows. Polygyny is not contingent on dealing with widows and the presence of widows in the society.
But doesn't the Quran tie that up? Surah 4 verse 3, in fact, ties that up. If you are not, if you cannot deal justly with the orphans,
well, the previous,
Yeah.
the previous paragraph is dealing about giving the orphans their property when they come of age. So it is for wardens of orphans, and only it is made contingent on 3 or 4 things, if they fear they won't be able to deal justly, and only if they can treat the wives equitably. This is historically contingent because there were no societal mechanisms to take care of female orphans or orphans at that time. That's not true in our own times. So marrying more women because there are more widows, actually most men, pardon me for saying so, I will just say so, are not looking to marry widows between you and me.
Of course, yeah.
The Maulvis in Pakistan are looking to marry 12, 11 and 9-year-old girls because they say the Prophet did so.
That's
to which
shocking.
my response, is the Prophet's dominant sunnah was to be married to a woman 15 years older than him. And during her life, he never married again. So if you're desperately trying to follow the Prophet, then follow his dominant sunnah. As far as Aisha's age, it is far from historically fixed, and people have sort of played around with it quite malleably. So
there's a book called by, I think I've got it, Adal Salahi, where there's a lot of writings on that aspect, about the age being much older, and they of course compare her to her sister's age, and some have hypothecated that it could be 18 or 19 and so on. But what was interesting to me is that some years back I read a book by Layla Ahmed, I think it was Women Under Islam or Women in Islam, and which I found pretty offensive, if it is the same book that I'm considering or recall having read, that she described the marriage of Aisha and the Prophet as being somewhat tragic. Now, it appeared to me that she then also bought into this whole idea of phenomenon that Aisha was, as the records go, extremely young and a child, which, I mean, a lot of us, in fact, reject based on the fact that historically doesn't make sense at a number of levels. But a lot of the feminist critique against Islam is also on that particular basis, the age of Aisha. And I think Layla Ahmed Nawal al-Sadawi, who's not a Muslim, I mean, the Egyptian Nawal al-Sadawi, also made the kind of same kind. This has been one of the core attacks against Muslims, against the Quran, against Islam. And indeed, of course, you've got practice, as you've mentioned, in Pakistan, where this is still going on. And that basically lays grounds and basis to more kinds of critiques against this kind of conduct.
I actually don't get into debating Aisha's age because the first historical records on Aisha were compiled a century after she had passed away and at a time of political conflict between the Shia and Sunni Muslims. And one anathematized her and the other glorified her. So for me, that's not important. For me, what's important is that the Quran forbids lust and lewd behavior in a marriage, that it lays down certain frameworks for relationship, a spousal relationship. And I do not feel comfortable commenting on the life and choices of the Prophet. What I can comment on is the Quran itself, and it does not extol say marrying just virgins. It doesn't sort of say you must marry somebody who's young. In other words, what is permissible sometimes historically is not mandatory eternally. And if Muslims are hell-bent on making that confusion, I think it's self-serving.
Yeah, I think a lot can also be said on the fact that some of the traditional biographies of the Prophet, like Ibn Ishaq, particularly the one that was famously translated by Alfred Guillaume, a lot of the material is inaccurate. They don't have a strong, as much as hadith itself is problematic, the Sirah literature is far worse in the sense that the chain of narrations are even far more weaker. And so you've got, for example, the recension of Ibn Ishaq by Ibn Hisham about 200, 250 years later. And a lot of that material is the kind of historical baggage that we've basically inherited, but a lot of it is in fact dross. It's bad content, bad material, inauthentic material. And my good friend Dr. Shabir Ali from Toronto states that during the expansionist period of Islam, the Abbasids and the Umayyads, when they wanted to justify certain actions, they would mythologize the life of the Prophet, and so justify, for example, accumulating concubines or expansive warfare. And then they'd say, well, look, the Prophet did this. So they would invent sayings attributing it back to the Prophet and then justify it on their actions based on religious on religious terms, which has been invented in a sense.
Well, I think lots of people abuse religion. They abuse secular ideologies. People who want to find alibis in history will find them.
What would you say about some of the kind of modern translations of the Quran? I mean, in the English-speaking world, you've got, for example, one which was my favorite, not necessarily the most accurate, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, which I believe may have been your first translation, Muhammad Asad, and of course, you've got the one by Picketall, which undoubtedly these three translations have kind of shaped or actually connected the English-speaking Muslim to the Quran in the 20th century. Have you found any of them kind of tainted by approaches or patriarchal in terms of interpretation? Because I see Asad, for example, was far ahead of his time, and so was Yusuf Ali when he comes from the Ismaili community traditionally. But I mean, for 1934, reading it in 2023, a lot of his footnotes and commentary are quite modern and liberal for its time.
To speak about translation being tainted is really difficult thing because all translations are translations at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think it's up to the discerning reader to read more than one. I have also read Lale Bakhtiar's translation of the Quran, and certain passages that Wadud translated herself. There is Muhammad Halim's translation. I mean, by now there are so many different translations. And now for Muslims who are wanting to learn about Arabic, who are not native Arabic speakers or Arabic speakers, there are online dictionaries. So one doesn't have to rely on just one person.
And amongst the members of the Islamic movement, what I find this kind of lack of congruity, there's this lack of kind of congruity in the sense that you had within the Muslim movement, for example, two major contributors. One was Sayyid Qutb and the other Maududi, the one that produced Fi Zilal al-Quran, and the other one was the Tafhim al-Quran by Maududi under the Jamaat-e-Islami. Maududi's works particularly has been to a certain extent, in certain respects, misogynistic. One could make the argument, but they haven't been accepted by the traditional religious establishment. So, for example, even up to today, Qutb is very much viewed as an aberration. Maududi himself within the Pakistani religious ulama circles and fraternity was, even to this day, basically viewed as an aberration. Have you seen some sort of probably a shift in paradigm and in approach to the Quran within the Islamic movement, and more particularly leading up to 2023?
Yusuf, you know more about the Islamic movement because I haven't done much research on it. I do know that Maududi's translations of the Quran and his commentary on the Quran are to be found almost everywhere in prisons in the United States because African American converts to Islam, you know, they have libraries in prisons, and so they only have access to Maududi's translations. And I know this because I've been asked to speak to some of these converts inside the prison. And I was very shocked to find that they only had access to Maududi's commentaries because the Saudi government has been, you know, bestowing these commentaries for free everywhere. So, but the issue of fighting over meaning, over commentaries is not something that interests me at all. It's very far away from what I do. I am not interested in these kinds of squabbles. For me, the rather bigger issue is how do Muslims know the God of the Quran? Because when I look around, I don't see the God of the Quran anywhere in the practice of Islam today. And I used to teach at a summer school on Islam and decoloniality in Granada in Spain over the summers. And there were people who came, Muslims from many different European countries. And they were all looking to engage with the Quran in a meaningful way. And a couple of times, a number of them cried in the audience when I spoke about God. And they said, it's so rare in academic circles to ever mention God in relation to the Quran. It's as if the Quran exists sui generis by itself. There it is, like a text, and let's fight over its meanings and the meaning of this word and that word. I think that's a real abuse of Islam and the Quran by Muslims who do that. My interest in the Quran extends only to the extent that it is the word of the God I worship. And if we cannot see that God in the practice of Islam today, then it is, I don't care about tradition or anything else. That's not more important than how we live in light of the word of the God we worship. So for me, the book isn't just a book out there, it's a testimonial to faith. It's a testimonial to the God Muslims are called on to worship. So all this Muslim squabbling does not interest me in the least.
Well said. One of the other aspects in your book is that you focus significantly, and which indeed, you know, we can all generally confirm, the source of anti-women, misogynistic narratives that could be found in the Hadith. Now, you make a very telling and an interesting point, I never saw it before, is that you basically mentioned in discussing the whole development and evolution of the Hadith that the Ahadith, of course, you know, combining it with the tafsir, made possible what you describe as the textual and religious eclecticism necessary for accommodating cultural pluralism. And when conflicts arose between their authority and that of the Qur'an, scholars like Ash-Shafi resolved them in favor of the hadith and tafsir. And, could you unpack that for us? Because basically, as I understand, what you're seeking to suggest is that these thinkers and writers and scholars and leaders were attempting to kind of impose on people a kind of a uniform, monolithic understanding or interpretation of Islam, or the so-called Prophet Sunnah, by incorporating aspects or discourses, or themes that were in certain instances at tension with or even contradicted the Quran at a fundamental level, but at the same time they somehow or the other justified this on religious means, by religious edicts, by
Right.
religious decisions. Is that the understanding of what you were saying?
Yes, as far as the misogyny is concerned, I would say that, I don't think the guys went out of the way, these scholars, to be misogynistic. Misogyny has been around for, thousands of years, and it's very deeply rooted in our cultures, and Muslims aren't alone in this. The UN put out a report several years ago saying that over 1 billion women all around the world will be, will be subject to violence of some sort and killing, and lots of hideous, horrible behavior in every single community. So where misogyny is concerned, no community, no society, no state, no civilization has clean hands. So I'm not going to beat up on Muslims only for that. They were very much, as you've said several times, products of their own times. What I'm arguing for is a reversal in what passes as Islamic methodology, which, as I have understood it from reading critiques of, say, the Hanafi legal school written by people like Brannon Wheeler, is that, and generally those who use hadith-based interpretations of the Quran, is that the Sunnah rules on the Quran does not rule on the Sunnah. The Sunnah includes the hadith. But if the hadith countermand the Quran, then we come down to saying the hadith override the Quran. And I am saying that instead of being so worried about the legitimacy and the lines of transmission of the hadith and using the hadith to interpret the Quran, why not the reverse? Why not use the Quran to, shall we say, adjudicate on the appropriateness of a hadith, regardless of who's narrating it?
Well, when you say, speaking about canonicity, when you then mention that the canonical authority of the hadith material had less to do then with the accuracy of the content than with the unanimous collective consciousness of the Islamic community back then, what are you actually referring to?
I think the critique is that as long as the narrator of the hadith was considered reliable, that Muslims did not pay enough attention to what that narrator was saying. And so a lot of attention was placed on the chain of transmission rather than on the content of the hadith. And that's not my claim. I simply put it there because it struck me as very powerful. That if you come along and you narrate something, I'm just going to take it as a given because of your lineage. So for me, that's a problem, because if you're speaking about two texts, in the different sources of textual authority in Islam, the Hadith are one and the Quran is the other, and the Tafsir. So my own sense is that since the Quran for observant Muslims is the word of God, why not use the Quran's teachings to comment on the Hadith rather than the other way around? There's been an inversion of authority, so that the religious knowledge men have produced now gains ascendancy over the word of God.
Would the fact then not be then to redefine the criteria? I mean, there's an interesting book, I don't know if you're familiar with this, by Israr Ahmed Khan. He's written a book called Authentication of Hadith, Redefining the Criteria. And similar to your argument, basically he suggests that the manner or the the textual content of the hadith itself has never been the concern, but by virtue of the fact that Muslim society and Muslims in subsequent generations have placed a far more greater degree of concern on the transmitter and the chain of narrations. So, for example, if somebody says this comes from Bukhari, the name itself, Bukhari, becomes sacrosanct, regardless of the fact that you may have absolute rubbish. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with one hadith which comes to mind, I think volume 1, hadith number 277, which speaks about Moses having a bath and a stone runs away with his clothes. And then the children of Israel then see that he's got no scrotal hernia. This kind of nonsense, hogwash, which I would call, which is there. But people won't critique the content or the ludicrousness of this, or the fact that, for example, monkeys would be stoned. One monkey will be stoning another monkey for having committed adultery. The content doesn't seem to be the concern. It's just the fact that the names, the titles, who's the transmitter, where does this come from? So on the basis of attempting to preserve the reputation of the transmitter or the author of the book, they then compromise even the life of the Prophet by incorporating such kind of rubbish.
Agreed.
So when you then say in your book that scholars explain tendentiousness in the hadith with reference to various factors, including the aspiration of the pious condemned to live in an age of social and moral decay to locate precedents for their own desires, are you then inferring that people were then attempting to seek forms of justification for bad behavior by inventing sayings, attributing it back to the Prophet and saying, well, look, there's some sort of religious precedent for my action. So if I want to have sex with a concubine or a sex slave, well, it can be done. This is what was happening in the time of the Prophet. Is that what you're saying?
Well, before you've said it better than I can say, so I will say the following, that's one of the problems with venerating tradition mindlessly. Because then what you're doing is you're setting yourself up in a nice cozy little box and you never need to get out of it, because you can, the invention of tradition, that's the name of a book by Hobsbawm. It's what the British did in India. So you go to India and you invent traditions for the Indians, which the Indians embrace as their own. It's absurd. And to me, these kinds of practices, I think, have explained what I recently started referring to as folk Islam, because I don't see that Islam as practiced on the ground as having much to do with the kind of religious observance I think is called for by the Qur'an. So, yes.
What should we do then? Because you see, Professor, a lot of this is part of our history. We are now stuck with this. It's 1400 years later, and to even attempt a task, probably people would get together of kind of, because what you're actually calling for, and what other people of like-minded intellect of your caliber are calling for at one level, and what I would aspire to is the idea that at some level you need a total overhaul of the traditional content of Islam and start from, in a manner of speaking, year zero with the Qur'an and the prophetic paradigm as your absolute reference frame. But are we not too late for that? We can only struggle. We have 1.2 billion people. You've got the clerical establishment, you've got the religious bodies out there that have still up to this day such a strong stranglehold. Is this going to be a perpetual struggle for subsequent generations?
I'm actually pretty hopeful about some subsequent generations for the following reason, and this again is a personal one. I think it was in 1999 that Professor Halim, who was at SOS, invited me to a Quran conference. And as I was speaking, there was a row of elderly Arab scholars, all men sitting in the front, who started to hiss at me while I was speaking.
Hiss?
And hiss, like this. So I stopped initially because I didn't know what that was. So there were a whole row of old men sort of hissing very violently. So I didn't know what to make of it. It was my first conference ever on the Quran.
They were becoming snakes. They must have been transforming into snakes.
And then after I finished, this group of young Pakistani boys who were third generation immigrants in Britain, they came on the stage and they would not let me get off the stage. And they were shouting in my face and they were so close to me, I could feel their breath in this spit. And they were saying, "You're not Al-Ghazali. How dare you say God is not a man? Who are you? Who do you think you are?" So this went on for about 5-10 minutes. And I was pretty shaken. I mean, these guys were even younger than my son at the time. Anyway, that was my day of presentation. The next day I came back for the next presentation. One of the guys walked up to me, a young Pakistani boy, and he said, "You know what made me most angry with you yesterday?" And I said, "No." He said, "You weren't afraid." Because when they yelled at me, it's not, I don't remember what I yelled back at them, but I certainly did. Because, and he said, "I will think about what you said." Because when the Quran says Allahu, I said, "Well, you're confusing the signified with the signified." He was able to have a conversation with me. I would not have approached him because I was so appalled at his disrespect, just age-wise.
It's disgusting
But
conduct.
no, let's follow up. In 2019, my book was published by Saki, and I was invited to give 2-3 presentations, and I gave one at one of the, I've forgotten, the institute. It was not Aga Khan. And the room was full of women. And after I finished talking, there was a rush towards me, and I thought, oh God. But Yusuf, some of them were crying. Some of them said, "My mother read your book. They wanted me to come hear you." It's not about me. It was an urge in these young women. 20 years went by between those two events. In 20 years, so much changed. It totally shifted my view on what was happening. And then I was in Leeds at the invitation of a friend and a colleague. I gave a talk there, same response. Long lines of women wanting to talk about the Quran, about the book. Things are shifting. So I don't think all of the young generation is trapped in this, whatever is happening within the so-called Islamic movement. And I say so-called because I don't see Islam in a lot of these Islamic movements. Yeah. I do see Muslims quarreling with each other and to no good ends. But there are lots of Muslims who are not part of this. We are outside these circles, and we are finding our own ways to be Muslim in a way that's meaningful to us.
Mm-hmm. And I think for a large portion is that at one level your book is very academic and it's conceptual and it requires but when I was reading your book, I felt, and I certainly felt that, and I don't know if others have told you that, it felt like you were speaking for the underdog. You were speaking for the average Muslim. You were basically articulating a view and a perspective and a vision, which is how the ordinary Muslim has to basically, engage in his faith, not in a kind of with some sort of overt degree of excessive religiosity or fanaticism or some kind of self-righteous modicum, but a kind of a sincere, and I think that's one thing that came out from your book is the level of sincerity. It doesn't come out as, obnoxious or as some of these other materials and books out there are. And it's really a sincere attempt to connect how the ordinary Muslim can in fact connect with the Quran. And then that's why I say that on the one hand, it is sincere, but at the same time, I view it as a sledgehammer because, I mean, a lot of the arguments are kind of, in on a number of levels, really, irrefutable, in my humble opinion. I want to move on to the aspect, and I understand that time is at a premium also, but, in kind of reaching the end of our discussion, the aspect of the Sharia, the understanding of the Sharia and your understanding of the Sharia. You stated, and I think I've seen it in your book, where you made the point that the Sharia, as is understood or as has been developed, has been the preserve of men, or has been developed by men. And it's something that was articulated by both Ziauddin Sadr and Parvez Manzoor, where they state that many Muslims consider the Sharia to be divine, but the Sharia is not divine. It's actually an attempt to understand, I think it's a human attempt to understand the absolute reference frame within a particular context. And what comprises the Sharia today is in fact fiqh, which is jurisprudence, which is a juristic interpretation of the classical jurists. So de facto, that in itself cannot be divine, because that's also an interpretation. What would you see as problematic about Sharia? Because there's two aspects here. On the one hand, you've got this Islamophobic assault ideologically against Muslims and against Islam, that the Sharia is barbaric, the Sharia does not recognize human rights, it oppresses women, it condemns women to the lowest of low. And then, of course, you've got this apologetic response on the other side, which says, well, look, the Sharia is humane. It does not oppress. It does not basically, break down society in any way. And it seems that both sides are, again, playing against each other, but they don't get down to the root of the issue, is that what you have today as Sharia is, in fact, a classical jurisprudence, which is developed much later. What would you define and see as problematic with Muslim practical applications of the Sharia?
So it's not just that men have produced fiqh and therefore it is problematic. It's exactly how it is being produced and what it represents. I think men are equally capable of reading the Qur'an for liberation as are women, and men are equally capable of producing knowledge that's humanizing and revolutionary as are women. I don't privilege gender or sex. So I do want to make that correction. But I simply point out that in Muslim circles, it's a handful of men, mostly experts, Arabic speaking and Arabs, who have come to monopolize the meaning of what Islam is. The Quran itself says it, doesn't say it came for experts, it came for Arabs, it came only for men, and it came only for the literate. In fact, it says it came also for the unlettered Bedouin in the desert. But coming back to the Sharia, as you've pointed out, Sharia simply means the way. And I have been most influenced by the work of Abdullahi al-Naim on this topic, and some of the work of Fazlur Rahman. So I'm not aware of, there's also Zeba Mir Husseini, who distinguishes between Sharia and fiqh. And to the extent that law has to keep up with the times, I would offer the same critique of a fixed notion of fiqh that I did of tradition. And Muslim laws are not always in compliance with many Quranic teachings or with the spirit of the Quran, So, because again, this work was produced centuries ago in a very different historical, social, political, and sexual context. And for Muslims to continue to cling to that is a problem. And I think Muslims have to put their own house in order before they start to beat up on other critics of Islam. Those critics have been around since Islam first came into being. Islamophobia is just the latest name for antipathy to Islam that dates from the 9th century. I don't know if you know that some of the earliest representations of the Prophet were as the Antichrist. And this is way before Christians, this is even before the First Crusade, by the way. So it wasn't that there was violence between the so-called East and West, or Islam and the West. And there was no West at the time. Muslims were in the West before the West became the West.
Yeah.
Leaving that aside, these representations of Islam as antithetical to Christianity, the Prophet as an Antichrist, these date back from the 9th century on. So that Islamophobia is the newest name for that antipathy, and it's been around forever. So, how much credence can one give to centuries-old recycling of pejorative images of Islam? And I think it says more about those who recycle these images. I'm sort of tempted to speak about the return of the repressed, that, encountering Islam may have been a huge trauma for Westerners, and why it keeps returning is something we need to understand. But I can't really blame them for saying certain things about how Muslims behave when that's my own critique of Muslims.
Are we responsible for Islamophobia? I mean, the negative view that Western media has about the Sharia, are we responsible for that?
Are we responsible for racism? Are we responsible for sexism? Are women responsible for sexism? Are you and I responsible for racism because we are people of color?
No, of course not.
Okay, then my answer to you is the same.
Okay, that's an interesting, sharp comment on that. You mentioned canonizing ijma within the classical period. Ijma itself was basically consensus of the community. However, it was limited to consensus of a certain religious group or clique or religious
Jurists.
community, jurists,
Yeah.
basically. In doing so, was that position itself not heterodox? Because it's like a kind of a schizophrenic position that if you oppose that position, if you oppose the classical fiqh, you're taking a position which is heterodox and not the orthodox one. But the position of the classical fuqaha themselves were also heterodox because they engage in the whole process of rethinking, of applying ijtihad, which was then subsequently deemed as an innovation. So is it not kind of a, it's an exercise in cynicism at some level?
Okay, so Yusuf, I hope what I say doesn't sound very cynical, but I have to say that I don't believe in consensus in religion.
Okay.
Because I read the Quran as authorizing a radical individualism when it charges each and every one of us to exercise our own akal and ilm, such as God has given those to us, to decipher the signs of God for ourselves. There's no orthodoxy that the Quran sets up. There's no clergy that the Quran sets up. There's no church in Islam, but for all practical purposes, we have a church and a self-anointed clergy in the form of these scholars in Islam. So I would say I'm not a huge one on consensus. It does not worry me because the consensus of the community is terrible and horrific. The consensus of the community in the United States many years ago was that indigenous people are not human beings. There is consensus in the society today, you can see for yourself, is that black and brown people are not fully human. The consensus in Muslim societies is that women are lesser, even though the Quran says we created you from a single self. So I do not care at all for consensus. I also do not think Muslims should bother themselves with each other's religious practices. I also do not believe in the institutionalization of Islam the way those institutions function today, because the Quran does not authorize it. I'm a Quran-only Muslim.
Okay. Could I ask this question then? The contrary position, could that not apply? I find your position very appealing, and it's something that I yearn towards, and I do myself. But could the argument not also be made that individualistic, I wouldn't say liberal, but individualistic approaches to the Quran could in certain instances also lead to an aberration? I mean, take for example, as you know, we can't obviously focus it on this particular aspect, but take for example the classical Islamic period, the Khawarij. They adopted an individualistic approach distinct from the religious community. Amongst the ultra conservatives today in South Africa, in society, in the Muslim world, they would, for example, say, as fanatical and as ultra conservative as they would, for example, say that the approach of ISIS is an aberration because it's very much also an individualistic approach to the Quran. So I'm saying, could individualistic approaches to the Quran not lead to potential aberrations in the same way that traditional consensus, for example, could lead to abuse, like in Nazi Germany or in America, in your country? Could the contrary position not also apply?
Okay, so I would say, do you think that collective approaches to Islam have not created aberrations for Muslims?
No, of course they are.
Okay.
But they've created
So
multiple
second point, Yusuf.
Yes.
You and I will stand before our Creator by ourselves. There will be no one behind you. No one. And no one behind me. I don't care for a sense of community at the cost of living a life that I think is aligned with the Quran. I'm not harming anybody. I'm not imposing my views on others. I'm not minding the business of my Muslim neighbors. I'm not telling you how high to wear your shalwar and how long to cut your beard. I'm not telling Muslim women they need to cover their heads if they don't wish to, because we were not authorized to do this, Yusuf. Yes, the Quran says believers are those who enjoin the right and forbid what is wrong. It doesn't say you can forbid the wrong by becoming a religious police over others.
No.
It's so bad in Pakistan that there's an Institute of Islamic Studies and the mullahs on the first floor have sent fatwas against the mullahs on the third floor. I could care less for this form of Islam.
I mean, it's something which I've come across, a book called Toxic Faith, Understanding and Overcoming Religious Addiction. And it seems to me that, I mean, we've had this kind of, I would say, religiosity, addiction of religiosity for a long, long time. And I think that's a problem. But Sister Asma, do you not, for example, call upon to the idea that there are certain, universals in the Quran, absolute reference frames, which is found in the Quran and the prophetic paradigm, that at one level can and should be at the very least implemented in society, the idea of justice, the idea of truth, the idea of morality. And as a collective community, that can be far more effectively implemented in society and practically applied, as opposed to just simply at an individualistic level without any kind of regulation. Because I think what you're calling for is a kind of a libertarian, your approach would be somewhat libertarian.
Well, if there's no church, there is no clergy, there's no group of people. If that has been charged with this religious authority, there's no religious police. If the Prophet is told in the Quran over and over, you are but my messenger, you are there only to warn, you are not responsible for anybody else. Well, for me, that's enough. Yes, I would want to see a society that's just. I would like to see a society that's egalitarian. But I am not going to go there and impose anything. I don't think anybody else should either. Now, that's an idealistic way to look at religion. But you see, Yusuf, in Surah Al-Kafirun, it says to you be your way and to me mine. This is my way.
And I mean, it's quite a tolerant, peaceful, and Quranic way, which is Quranically justified and Quranically centered. And this comes back to the idea about the notion of generalizing the particular. Is that where the problem also arises amongst the conservatives, which you pointed out that the Quran's universalism, on the one hand, the embodiment of divine speech, it's universal in nature, but there are certain aspects which are particularly historically specific. And so they adopt this position of attempting to dehistoricize the Quran and then just simply make everything applicable. So Surah 9 verse 5, which was applicable in a particular context, or 929 in the time of the Byzantine invasion, that now becomes perpetual and eternal. Is that the problem? And is that what you see as happening today in our communities?
If all of that points to the fact that the group of people who's pushing that idea benefits from it, then I suspect it. Because I don't think that this is coming out of altruism. And I keep hearing about protecting Islam and safeguarding Islam, to which my response is Islam does not need you.
Yeah.
You need it. And this is not your God. God does not belong to any of us. Rather, we belong to God if God wishes to claim us. So for me, this is all upside down. And that's why, Yusuf, I live on the fringes of society. I live as a solitary, and I live as a person who's largely, ironically, unplugged from all of this insanity, the toxicity.
Madness.
Yeah. It's madness that in the name of God, butchery, barbarism, and everything else goes. But the same happens in the name of secularism.
Yeah.
In the name of some ideology, we are going to wield the stick over others. I'm not interested in that, Yusuf.
I want to, I know we are, I'm tempted to ask you this, but I know time is limited and I just want to pickle your brain. So we're going to wrap up now. We've seen now, and in the West, and certainly in the States, and we had a couple of programs in South Africa by two characters that come from the UK, speaking about the LGBTQI community. Now, there's two aspects to this. The one aspect is that, certainly I'm not going to go into the whole discussion of homosexuality, and we know the position and the practice and all of that. But I'm saying, as far as an agenda that is at play, do you see something pernicious happening at this particular point in time to our communities and societies in the States? Because what you guys are having in the States are what we are also experiencing now in South Africa, where transgender women come to schools, and there's a total, a total kind of breakdown in family structure, or parents and children. Is that a problem that we should be concerned of?
Having just said that I really don't involve myself in these issues, it would be very strange for me to say it's a problem that other people should be concerned about. I mean, if people are concerned about it, I can't help it.
Well, what would you do? What would you do, Professor? I mean, you're someone who's an expert in the issue of gender studies and so on. I mean, surely you
I'm
don't
not
want to.
An expert. No, what I will say is that when LGBTQ Muslims talk to me,
yeah,
I tell them I'm not the Pope of Islam.
Sure.
If you love God and you worship God, that's between you and God.
But the idea of imposing that agenda on children, that becomes problematic to the extent that they want to
now. Imposing anything on anybody becomes problematic. Absolutely, I agree with you. If it's imposed and you're serving a particular agenda in that service, but that's what politics is about, Yusuf. That's what religion is about. It's the stake with which we beat people and impose our will on people. And I'm resisting that idea for myself. I don't want to be the one holding that stake, because I do not know the extent of the mercy of my Creator.
Well, I think it's well said. What would, as a parting word for the South African viewers, both Muslim and non-Muslim, that will be seeing this, what would your advice be to them, particularly, firstly, the Muslims, and I'm talking about Muslim public as well as the Muslim clergy and the non-Muslim public who watch this podcast? What would be your parting words to them in relation to your book and certainly the approach to the Qur'an?
Well, I would say the Quran is a message that we are called on, Muslims, observant Muslims, people who want to be, are asked to dwell on. It's a journey with the Quran. The Quran cannot become a battleground for sordid political and religious fights and for imposing one's will on another. As far as my book is concerned, as you said, it's a difficult book to read. And
there's an easier book out there. There's an easier book that's written.
There's a brief introduction.
I haven't had access to it.
Yeah, there's a brief introduction, but I would say, it's there for anybody to read. If anybody ever wants to write to me about it and talk to me about it, I'm open about that. But all I can say is what I practice myself, which is that my deen, my understanding of it is my own. I'm not answerable to you, to the person in the street, or my neighbor, or my relatives. I'm responsible to God. And that's not a way that I think people can live collectively, but there's no harm in hoping that one can actually be satisfied with it, to find meaning on one's own for oneself, and to be deeply rooted in it, and a meaning that actually doesn't harm other people.
Well, I want to thank you for this discussion. I hope we have more discussions in the future on other issues. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure, and I've certainly been enlightened. I really love your book, and I highly recommend the book. It's called Believing Women in Islam, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Qur'an. It's available online via Amazon, as well as at your local bookstore. I'm not so sure if they're available in local Islamic bookstores in South Africa, but if you don't have it, you can get it on Amazon, or alternatively on Take a Lot. It's been an excellent session. I've been interviewing Asma Barlas, the Pakistani-American writer and academic, and her specialities have been comparative and international politics, Islam, and Quranic hermeneutics. It's been a privilege. It's been a joy. And to all of you out there, take care wherever you're traveling. Be safe. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whichever part of the world you are in. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam and thank you.